You who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited to once again be able to give you guys some insights, and we can have a mikra, or an interaction or a live interaction with each other. Looking forward to giving you guys some insight into the cycles some more. So without any further preamble, let's jump into it. So first and foremost, let's just say that this particular section of the cycles is pretty cool, but also it's got some depth to it. So somebody might ask me a question. Well, where do you get this idea of cycles? Like, what's the big deal? Why are cycles important? What's the point behind giving this teaching? Why are you expanding on this knowledge? Well, I can start at the very beginning, and I will tell you that it had to do with a realization that Solomon was the wisest man who had ever lived. Such as never was before, so shall never be again. We could get into all kinds of discussions like, well, what about Yeshua? What about Yeshua HaMashiach? What about Jesus Christ? Was he as wise as Solomon, or was he wiser? Well, I guess we need to decide if the scripture can be broken or not, right? Because we know that the scripture, which would be the writings, says that Solomon was the wisest, right? Okay. Scripture, as in the Greek word graphe, which means the writings. Remember, the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, is made up of the law, the prophets, and the writings, or the Torah, the Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And so Yeshua, speaking in John chapter 10, when he says, "You are all gods," says the scripture cannot be broken. He's talking about the Psalms, the Proverbs, etc. But there's a specific set of books that are distinguished from the rest. And one of those books in that set, which I'm not going to mention the name of that set, but one of the books in that set is Ecclesiastes. Now, there's a couple things that are important about Ecclesiastes. The first is that it actually has a horrible title, okay? The second is that if you do not understand Torah, you will not understand Ecclesiastes. And if you think for a second that you can actually take Ecclesiastes and apply it to modern application of culture, you are mistaken. You need to go back to Solomon's time to really grasp the level of magnitude of Ecclesiastes. I've talked about correspondence, and I've talked about, that that's a hermetic principle. However, Paul seems to have had this ancient wisdom of correspondence, being that what we need to understand about the things we don't understand are right in front of us. And the short version of that is if you need to understand something about the higher realms, you need to understand something about the higher, more supernatural realms that are part of our system. Paul speaks in Ephesians on a number of places, 5 to be exact, that we are somehow inside of heavenly places, right? Okay. And of course, we can get into all kinds of discussions about dimensions, and we can get into parallel universes, etc., etc. But the truth is that if we just go ahead and accept that everything around us that we can see, that is tangible, that we can hear, that we can touch, and that we can see, tells us what we need to know about the higher realms. The reason for that is obviously one of the keys is emanation. You see, the difference between a Hebrew and a Christian is the Christian believes that the reason why we can acknowledge that there is a deification of Yeshua is because there's a deification of us. And the reason why we can acknowledge that there is divine power within the Christ or within Yeshua is because there's divine power within us. You know, this morning actually was one of those mornings where I woke up at a very early time, and the chimes that I own were ringing. Now, it's interesting because coincidence equated to a necessity to buy a set of chimes. Maybe not coincidence, but certain circumstances necessitated the chimes be purchased. At the time when I purchased them, I really didn't care about what they had contained within them. I only cared about how they sounded in terms of if it was pleasant to me and if it equated to the magnitude of the healing that was going to occur. And so I know that sounded vague, but I could just short version say that a person who had some chimes lost those chimes and it really hurt them. And so I decided to buy them some chimes on occasion of something very special. In other words, it's kind of like a special occasion for them that they would receive a gift. So there were other people giving gifts, but I happened to believe that those chimes would be the most effective. Well, at any rate, those chimes ended up in our yard. Well, at any rate, the chimes just so happen to be tuned to the key of G, which consequently corresponds to the solar plexus chakra, which consequently corresponds to Tiferet in the Kabbalistic tree, which consequently corresponds to Yeshua, which consequently corresponds to a balance of all things, but a swinging to one direction or the other as one pulls the other, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The adjustment that we're going to have to make in our thinking is going to come in the form of an understanding of position, and I will explain that as well. But this concept of that which has been made communicates his invisible attributes, eternal power, and divine nature. A divine nature and eternal power that we are allowed to partake in 1 Peter or in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3 through 5. I would say it would be a good place, what I call the easy button. We've been given everything that pertains to life and godliness, and basically that we would be able to partake in or be a part of or be contained in the divine nature and eternal power of God. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. We need to talk a little bit about the God of the Christians versus the God of the Hebrews. We need to talk a little bit about the relationship between God and Christ. We need to talk about the context or the concept of Lord. But let's start at the very beginning, because I think there's some very important areas that we need to kind of touch upon, and perhaps there will be some necessity for some recap. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to go into Ecclesiastes to begin with. Okay, Ecclesiastes chapter 1. That's not the right screen. There we go. And it says what? The words of a preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, we know the only son of David that was king in Jerusalem is Solomon. So we're going to go ahead and attach Solomon's wisdom to all of this book. Well, then he gets into some funkiness here, right? Vanity of vanities, said the preacher. Vanity of vanities. The whole is vanities. Oh my gosh. If there was any more bathroom fixtures in this verse. Okay, so then let's jump to the next verse. What advantage is to man by all his labor that he labors under the sun? Verse 4, generation is going and a generation is coming, and the earth to the age is standing. Also, the sun hath risen and the sun hath gone, in, and unto its place, panting, it is rising there. Going unto the south and turning around unto the north, turning around, the wind is going, and by its circuits the wind hath returned. All the streams are going unto the sea, and the sea is not full. Unto a place whither the streams are going, thither they are returning back to go. All these things are wearying, and man is not able to speak. The eye is not satisfied by seeing, nor the ear by feeling from hearing. What is that which hath been is that which is, and what which hath been done, it is that which is done, and there is not an entirely new thing under the sun. Well, that was the Young's literal translation, and although I probably shouldn't have started with that, I probably should have started with something a little bit more readable, I want to talk about this one. Verse 7, rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Okay, well, that's a bunch of fun. Why? Because what we are actually working with here is the water cycle, right? So let's talk a minute about this water cycle. We will begin with the idea of a river because that's where Solomon starts. So how does a river begin? It begins as tributary melt, right? Melt from snow trickling down into the path of least resistance, and then eventually joining into a river. And as the river flows down as a result of gravity, let's say, there's probably possibly other reasons for it to flow, but we're not going to get into that because it gets into quantum mechanics. But the premise is as it moves, well, of course it doesn't really move either, but okay, we'll go with that. As we perceive that it moves, it goes down into the sea, and in the sea, it evaporates, okay? And as that evaporation occurs, then it condensates into clouds, and those clouds drop precipitation, and in the winter months, they drop snow, which doesn't flow down the mountain, but accumulates and becomes impacted. And then, of course, we start the river all over again. This is the water cycle, right? So what is going on in the water cycle? Well, some really interesting things, okay? So I think what we could probably do is go ahead and accept that snow is a solid form of a river. Wait, of a sea. Wait, of a cloud. All of those, right? So snow is potentially a river, potentially a sea, potentially a cloud, but what's weird is snow is potentially snow. You see, the power behind the water cycle gives us an insight into something extraordinarily powerful, which is that which was is what will be. You see, most rabbis go through about, 7 years of the study of Talmud, and they go through a number of Jewish jurisprudence types, understanding the Torah, and some other wisdoms, and of course Gen Ed or whatever. And a rabbi usually pops out, gets his certification, and then the rabbinate in New York kind of decides where he could best fit in with synagogues, and then of course he's assigned a congregation, etc., etc. And all that takes around maybe 5 to 7 years, maybe a little bit longer. But my point is that in all of that study and all of that seeking, they're not checking into the other elements of what has been claimed to be Judaism, which of course would be a faction of Christianity, but also an acceptance and a belief in Messiah Yeshua. But it's more than that, because you spend all this time learning, but then once you get a congregation is when you actually start learning, because only then do you get to answer questions that you would never be asked by your professor. And I'm telling you, there are some profound questions that have come through. And one of the questions that came through is, what's the point if this is what Solomon says? Well, I'm going to share with you, this is actually massively important for a few reasons. Number one is because back in the early century, last century, we had a competition, so to speak, to produce what nowadays is accepted as a, I don't know, an entitlement. Yeah, because really, if you think about it, electricity is not a hope for you. Electricity is not a thing to be conserved by you. Electricity is an expectation. You expect that when you go to your outlet and plug in your thing, that it is going to work, or when you throw on a light, that it's going to work, right? And really, technically, there's almost kind of a reaction to the idea that somebody be without electricity. It's unheard of. It's absurd. But in the early last century, we had a kind of a race going on to try to develop and bring into consideration the reality of electricity. And we had Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison kind of in contention with each other about how it should work. When Nikola Tesla stumbles upon this reality, and we're not quite sure how he stumbles upon this reality, but when he stumbles upon this reality, which consequently today is kind of called vortex mathematics, there is kind of this premise that from that moment on, he understood that his electricity was superior to Edison's electricity. However, Edison, being the businessman that he was, had already created power plants using DC electricity. And as he moved in the direction of DC electricity, which is a positive or negative charge moving to a positive or negative charge in one single direction, and it is low voltage. Well, Nikola Tesla, in his infinite wisdom, said, everything that pertains to the universe needs to be thought of in terms of frequency, vibration, and energy. And the 369 and the power of the 369 and the other things that he said in that same speech. However, there is something very, very important that we need to look at that a lot of people don't realize. For that, I think we probably need to go to the board. So let's go ahead and jump over there to the board, and we will go ahead and take a look at some of this stuff. Well, first and foremost, I think we'll go ahead and draw us a nice, big, bright orange circle to represent a cycle, okay? And this particular cycle, I think we're going to go ahead and represent this in blue as appropriate because it is the water cycle. So let's say that we have, oh, you know what? I actually want to do this part in yellow. We have this interesting thing going on here, and I would just ask that those of you who are biased by the Trinity doctrine, for a moment, think outside the box and please accept that I have no intention here of connecting that erroneous heretic doctrine to this board. Okay, so, and for those of you who are new to this channel, please understand that if you're Torah observant, I am not trying to create an offense by drawing the Trinity symbol. Okay, this isn't the only Trinity symbol. This is one of them. Okay, but what I want to do here is I want to kind of, in fact, I'm actually going to rotate this a little bit. So I need a point about right here and a point about right here and a point about right here. That's probably how I need this. That's going to be a little bit less what it seems. And actually, we might even do better this way. Let's do this. Let's go with Solomon's version, which has 4 elements. That makes me feel even better. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and label these. Sorry, I had to work that out in my mind. Okay, so we're just going to say ocean. And we'll just say liquid. Okay. And then we're going to go over here and we're going to say snow. No, we're going to say river. Yeah, no, snow. Okay, snow. Right, which we're going to say solid. Okay, and then we're going to go, let's just do cloud, keep it simple. I know that there's more involved in this discussion than that, but let's just do cloud. And we're going to say gas. Okay, and then, of course, we're going to kind of have like a vapor, which is going to be a gas as well. And so what's interesting about this is, I mean, like we have the river, right? There's the river. Okay, and we have the evaporation. And we have the condensation. I don't know if I spelled that right. And then we have the precipitation. Well, that works, right? I mean, that kind of gives us a pretty good indicator of what Solomon said here. Let's read it again. Let's take a look at it over here. Let's read it again. Rivers run into the sea. Okay, we've got rivers, but the sea is never full. Okay, we've got the ocean. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Now, he doesn't explain that per se in the water cycle, but if it returns to the rivers again, how does it return? It returns by this evaporation. Now, let's say this evaporation, right? To vapor or gas. Okay. But what is interesting about this is that Solomon, being the wisest man who ever was, knew Tesla's insight, right? He knew frequency, energy, vibration. He knew all those things. You say, how do you know? Because it says, such as never was, shall never be again. Tesla was not smarter than Solomon. And there's evidence, even in certain tells, that Solomon was experimenting with electricity, but we won't get into that. And if they were using copper, it's very possible that they would not be able to find that copper today, but who knows? Anyways, so let's see. We're looking at the ocean, right? But we're going to start with the snow, and there's a reason we're going to start with the snow, and that's because this is going to be lowest hertz, lowest vibration. And what happens as something begins to heat up, its vibration increases, and therefore a river has a higher vibration than snow. And ocean has a higher vibration than a river in a sense because of its magnitude or its vastness, but really technically, we're still working with the same frequency per se in both of these because of the fact that they are liquid, which is a medium. A medium hertz. All righty. And then all of a sudden we come up here to gas and we have high est. Now here's the intrigue, and I probably should have put the vapor at the top, but I wanted to kind of give this idea of ascendancy, that as the vibration increases, not only does the material composition change, but also it is important to know that there are thresholds. Thresholds. So when we're talking about steam or vapor or gas, we need kind of a threshold to go from liquid to gas, okay? And that threshold is going to be something that until a certain amount of vibration and thereby temperature, well, that's very interesting that Hertz has something to do with temperature. As soon as a certain temperature is achieved, a liquid will change to a gas depending on the molecule. So the molecular structure of ice changes to a liquid after being heated to a certain temperature. That temperature that a liquid freezes at is the threshold of liquid. So in order to get a solid to a liquid, it has to heat up past a certain degrees Fahrenheit, which we know is anything above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Anything above 32 degrees Fahrenheit is going to change from a solid into a liquid when it comes to H2O or similar waters, okay? Now, that's not true of every element, but this particular element, water, has a good demonstrative indication that it has vibrations at a certain time period and level. And so we were able to really, really see the change. Why is this so important? Well, because the lower the vibration, the greater the solid. The higher the vibration, the greater the spirit. You say, what spirit? Well, let's talk about that a minute. Let's say that we go ahead and we go into the Septuagint for this particular part. We're not going to really get much. However, the word wind in verse 6 is going to be important. We go to the word wind in verse 6 and we have the word ruach, right? Ruach. Now, if you need to know that we're actually not talking about wind, but we're talking about spirit, you can go study out the word ruach. We're not going to do it today, but I am going to indicate to you that this, even though that it's translated wind, it should be translated spirit, but actually that word spirit is inappropriate. Now, having said that, ruach is going to become important here. Because why? Because when something turns into a gas, it is considered to be spirit in alchemy and also in chemistry. Okay, so when we are, let's see, how do I want to explain this? So when we are dealing with this water cycle and we get to the vapor, we know that a very specific process is occurring chemically, but we also need to understand that the higher the vibration that something is, it changes its composition. We go from a solid to a liquid to a gas, right? Okay, so let's take a look at this really quick. In the Septuagint, we are working with the word pneuma, right here. Pneuma. Now, we'll just go ahead and jump down to the New Testament usages of the word pneuma. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18. This is how Jesus, the Messiah, was born. His mother, Mary, was engaged to be married to Joseph. But before the marriage took place, she was still a virgin. She became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. And in the Greek, that particular verse reads, the exousia of the Spirit, which is holy. Okay? So going back to our word pneuma, and then going back to our word ruach, we get back to our verse in let's see, it'll probably be this one. We get back to our verse in Ecclesiastes. So you see how I made the journey here. Ecclesiastes 1:6. So jumping back to Ecclesiastes, you can see now that the concept of wind is not correct. But when we talk about wind, what are we really talking about? We're talking about pressure moving through air. And air is made up of vapor, although it contains other molecules, specifically nitrogen, zinc oxide, and a number of other things. Obviously, somewhere in there is the chlorofluorocarbons, etc. But generally speaking, air is water in a vaporized form as a result of obviously temperature, but also vibration. Sound, which is hertz, right? Sound, when it hits water molecules or hits air molecules, we'll call them just to stay on the safe side, it then will cause a very significant and patterned and pathwayed intensity that results in a vibration of the things in our ear and then is interpreted by our sensory organ to be perceived as a very specific sound. So the sound that water makes depends on the molecular structure. No, that's not correct. The molecular structure depends on the sound that the water makes at that moment that has something to do with the chemical process of heat, which we don't necessarily need to get into. But the premise here is that as there is a change in composition, there is a change in vibration, and the change in vibration then reflects the composition. So a solid vibrates slower than a gas. Understand? And why is that important? Because when we are dealing with specific vibrations, we are dealing with a certain level of ease or dis-ease, and very specifically a certain level of resistance to fluids that need to move through pathways. You guys, if you haven't gotten it by now, the entire composition of the spiritual process is contained within the water cycle. Now, a water cycle has a beginning and end, but truthfully not. It is infinite. And if you remember, I said that a cycle is never ending. So let's recap a little bit of what we've talked about with cycles thus far. We have talked about first that there was going to be on the fourth day a way to measure time, and that time had very specific assignments to it: signs, seasons, days, and years. But in the Hebrew, what? Otiot, Moedim, Yomim, and Shamim. Okay? Now, Shanim is the year, Yomim is the days, Moedim is the seasons, and Otiot is the signs. Now, I can prove through ancient Hebrew astrology that the concept of signs has to do with the zodiac, and very specifically with the movement of the planets and the appearance of comets. Okay? Ancient astronomy demonstrates that those were very specific indicators of certain things happening in the universe, or very specifically on the earth, and very specifically with certain kingdoms and with certain peoples and cultures, etc. So signs is more corresponding to indicating very specific and important time periods. Secondly, Moedim, meaning appointed times or observations. It seems to correspond more with certain things that are happening during the year. When we get into days, there are three important aspects of days: the counting of sevens, right? We've got the Shabbat, and we've also got the what? The counting of Omer, commanded in Leviticus chapter 23, resulting in the day of Pentecost, right? One more day after the 7 sevens. Then we've got days as representing an entire lunar cycle, which corresponds to a 28-day period. And there are a number of biological systems that are affected by those specific time periods. And then we have, furthermore, 365-ish days to represent the solar rotation, right? The cycle of a 12-month calendar, not really, but more like a cycle of rotation of the sun around the earth, which are easily measured from equinox to equinox to equinox. So if you want to really, really figure out when a time is, you can look at the solstices and you can look at the equinox, and you'll find that 365-day period. So there's our days. And then, of course, we have the years representing what? 7 years, or 7 years, which is one more year, Jubilee, etc. And then we also have years representing the days of our lives, right? These are the days of Sarah, or these are the years of Sarah, I guess I should say. But Moedim seems to correspond to something a little bit different, and Otiot seems to correspond to exact precision markings. To the extent that the Otiot that appeared in the sky and represented the things that it represented caused Magi from the east to show up in Jerusalem, ask questions about the Messiah because they wanted to worship him. Otiot. But today, what we really need to do is talk about Moedim. So we'll get to that, but then I want to remind you that we also concluded that, we plausibly concluded that Yahweh was continuing these cycles and therefore was resting on the Shabbat. And if he was resting on the Shabbat, then every Shabbat is blessed and sanctified. And then, of course, last week we came up with a very, very, very important truth. And that very, very, very important truth is that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, there are a number of people who lack an understanding of what the Son of Man means, and so they instantaneously attached or assigned that information to Yeshua. Well, in that process of assigning that information to Yeshua, we run into a very specific problem, and that is that there are lots of sons of men, and there are lots of sons of God, and there are also Elohim. And so the difference between a son versus an Elohim, the difference between Adam and a son of Adam are significant. But the premise is that Sabbath was actually made for you because you are valuable, okay? You're valuable because you exist, and the proof that you're valuable is in your existence, and therefore you are important because you exist. I can tell you my entire congregation this week, including myself, was tested in that information to whether we believed it or not this week, and corresponding even into furthermore next week for that matter. But the point being is that our water cycle teaches us that the amount of vibration that occurs within an element corresponds to the solidity or fluidity or liberty from any definition in vibration. It's connected to vibration. So we know solids vibrate at a lower frequency, liquids vibrate at a medium frequency, and vapor or spirits vibrates at a higher frequency altogether. Now, we could get into all kinds of stuff. We could say, okay, so that means that anything that is actually solid is actually at a very low vibration, and anything that is actually vapor is at a higher vibration. So eventually we need to become vapor. You're welcome. Okay, so the premise is that what we need to understand is that as we begin to move through vibration, there's going to come a point where our composition will change. Now, the intrigue is that right now, as a result of contusions or adhesions, or as a result of dis-ease, there are solids in your body right now that are preventing the fluidity of your body. Meaning what? There needs to be an evolution, right? Now, obviously, when we get into the physiology of a human, there's going to always be some sort of body that is solid, and that would necessarily need to be removed. In fact, that's what keeps most medical people in their job situation. In other words, what keeps people in their job in the medical field is the disease of the body, is the problems with the solids in the body, the contusions, the adhesions, waste, and disease. Well, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason is because what we need to be aware of is there's a dynamic to that, okay? There's an ebb and flow, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Now, the important part of what you're learning here does not have to do with your body or water or anything except to understand that there is a higher part of you that is not governed by the physical world and physiology and the physical manifestations of solids. I'm standing on a floor right now made of cellulose that laid over the top of itself and became a solid that is very structurally sound. And I'm talking about wood, right? Cellulose that layered over itself and is solid. So is there a benefit to solids? Well, I mean, I would rather be standing on this floor than outside. It's covered in snow. But the premise is that in all reality, those solids are vibrating at a very low frequency and are vibrating at a very low intelligence. Well, there's a lot we could get into with that, right? Because somewhere along the lines we could accept that vibration equates to intelligence. All right? But we need to talk a little bit more about cycles. So let me go ahead and get back to the board, and we will see if we can't gain a deeper understanding of this. All right, so now let's go ahead and just do another circle, but this time all I'm going to do is create a point on that circle. That's not a good color. Let's do this color. There we go, that's good contrast. So here's a point on this circle, and as this point goes around, there's a point in time where it is at the bottom of the circle and a point in time where it is at the top of the circle. So if we were to take a line and draw it next to the circle and mark those points on the circle, and then mark the midpoints on the circle, we would have something interesting occur. Because there's a point in time where it will reverse direction. So as it's going around in the circle, there's a point where it is going to stop at this higher point. Okay? So it's going to stop here. But when it's back at this point, it's going to stop here. Which means what? We have a going up and a coming down, okay? And that is at the core of the concept of dynamics, okay? Dynamics is the idea that something moves back and forth. So when we're dealing with the idea of composition, dynamics would always have to be fluid or higher. Now, the truth is that there's still a limitation, okay? Notice there's a top of the circle and there's a bottom of the circle, okay? Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this a little bit. So I am going to take, and let's see, how am I going to do this? I'm going to take this part here, and we're just going to draw a circle like this and shrink it down and move it up here into the corner. And then I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to shrink it down. And then I'm going to rotate it this direction, move it down a little bit. And now we no longer have top and bottom, but we have one side and another side, and we don't necessarily want to identify those as right and left, but we do need to get rid of top and bottom, because obviously since we rotated this thing, we have moved right to a different dimension. right? We're no longer in height, whether it be the top or the bottom of something, but we're in width. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take and I'm gonna draw real quick a line. Let's make it pink. And let's make it a little bit thicker so you can see it. And this is gonna be a central point line, okay? And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to attach to the top of that line a point. And then I'm going to attach to that same line, that should not be that color. I'm going to attach to that same line another important element, and that is going to be that this point from here to here is the furthest or the most extreme swing in this direction, which we'll just call direction number 2 because we don't want right or left to be involved in these dimensions. So this is direction number 2, and this is direction number 1, okay? All right, and so now the same principle is going to be applied, that we have another line going to direction number 1. Now, what has occurred here is something called swing and is related to dynamics. In fact, I think I need this to still be a little bit bigger. So we're going to go ahead and blow that back up because it's related to dynamics. And the context or the idea is that there is a movement from one point to another point, and then a returning as a result of a cycling around the circle. Okay? So the way that you could think about this is that there's a swing from solid to liquid, right? But there's a return to solid from liquid. It's just, it can potentially, in the water cycle, obviously have to go through the gas. But the interesting thing is the gas turns around and turns back into a liquid and then falls down onto the earth as accumulated snow. And that accumulated snow is then a solid, okay? So we could potentially say this way, that a solid is one side of the pendulum and a liquid is another side of the pendulum, because it's the higher or lower point on a cycle. Now, what's interesting is in that same breath, now I will draw a line this direction, and the line that we're drawing that direction, we're then going to correspond it in the same way by drawing this same measurement that we drew before of a top and bottom. But this time we're going to trace time concerning the circle. And so what I mean by that is that we're going to trace where this point, that particular point, ends up in time. So we will call this time, and we will call this the top. We'll just call it the top, and this the bottom. Okay? And so then now what we need to do, let's do a different color here. Let's do yellow. We're going to start at this point here. That didn't work. Yellow, there we go. We're going to start at this point here, and we're going to work towards this point here. So over time, what we're doing is just following the point, okay? And then we're going to go to this point here. And so then we need to go down here over time, right? Okay, so we've only made it halfway through. the circle. We started here, we ended here, so we really only gone 180 degrees. To really get the depth of this, we're going to have to go further than that. So let's draw this a little bit different. We're going to go down to the bottom, and then we're going to come back up to the top, which means what? We have 2 points at the top and 1 at the bottom. Well, if we were to keep going with this, it would look like this, okay? Why is that so important? Because the thing between here and here is the frequency of the cycle over time. Okay? Frequency. And vibration is the amount of oscillation that's occurring in that frequency. So if you play 1 cycle, that's 1 single vibration or 1 single oscillation. So frequency has to do with how many times over time this particular, I'm going to change the color of it for the sake of this discussion to this other green. This particular spot is the return to the frequency. And remember that particular spot, when it was this spot, corresponded to this point on the pendulum. What's my point? The swinging from one state to another equates to an oscillation of frequency and therefore vibration that has something to do with the condition of the element. You say, why would any of this be important? I will show you why. But before we do that, what I want you to explain to you is that when we are dealing with the condition of something, we need to understand that it's in a certain state for a certain amount of time at a certain vibration, right? A certain vibration. And so as a result of that, what we need to understand is that when we're working with high vibrational energy, we are dealing with something that is not governed by limitation, but as we go down in vibrational energy, then we discover something very specific, and that is this idea that there is a state in which it is less intelligent and it is less it is governed by height, width, depth, time. And the best way I could really show you that is through the idea of the cycle of rocks, right? They go through this cycle of sediment and then metamorphosis and then the igneous process, right? And that kind of happens as a cycle over and over in volcanism. But what's interesting is that the denser material sinks first, falls first, and the lighter material rises, okay? Which gets us back into vibration again, gets us back into some other things like atomic weight and all that, but that's okay. So now the reason why this is important is because of what I'm about to show you. And I think the best way that we could go about this next section is to just go ahead and take a journey to learn or understand the concept of the name Yahweh, what it was, what it has become, and what it will be. Okay? All right. So the best way for me to do this is to switch over here. And when I'm switching over here, what I want to do is go ahead and just go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, because we have the first usage of this title. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed a breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a living person, which of course we know is all of this is anthropomorphic symbolism for something way more advanced in its state. And that would be that when it says that he became a living soul, which is what it says in the Hebrew here. If we go into this living soul, we're going to this nefesh chayim right here. Nefesh chayim, that's living soul, not living being. Okay? All right. So yeah, this part of this verse right here is so important. And he became a living being. He who became Adam became a living being. Okay, now, what we need to look at here is that this is Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh Elohim. Okay, so there are a couple of very important functional things that we need to get our minds wrapped around, okay? When we are dealing with what Tesla came up with versus what Edison came up with, we have the magnetic induction engine creating what we call alternating current, which is a movement from positive to negative, back and forth from and the polarization switching. So as there's a current moving, which it doesn't actually move, I know that, but there's a current moving for the sake of argument. It's flowing in a certain direction, and all of a sudden it reverses direction. Do you see what I'm getting at? Tesla's frequency, energy, and vibration literally gave him an understanding on how to create alternating current and thereby move current down a power line for miles and miles and miles and miles at a very, very high voltage. 750,000 volts of electricity. If you want perspective, your home right now is only running at 110 volts. And for those of you who accidentally plugged in the vacuum wrong and got a little zing, I can tell you that little zing at 750,000 volts will just cause your composition, because of the vibration, to vaporize. Okay? And so as a result of that, now we need to gain an understanding that that which has been made tells us about that which we cannot understand. So we want to understand the intensification of all power in the universe. What do we know? We know that it is it's a non-depletable source. It doesn't have the ability to run out of energy. And it's not that energy is being created, it's that energy is emanating from it. In other words, the very existence of energy is origining at that moment. And it is a moment in time, yes, definitely a moment in time, but not how you understand time. Because it is more like it is the beginning of everything, but the truth is it's happening right now. In other words, the source of all living, the source of all things. Remember, in him we live and move and have our being. Let's take a look at those verses. So one of those verses is actually going to be important, and that is going to be in John chapter 1. John chapter 1, it says, he existed in the beginning with God. God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. The Word gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. Okay, so we could get into all kinds of quantum discussions just in these 3 verses that would blow your mind. But we're not going to do that. We're going to try to keep this a little bit simpler, okay? And understand that the premise is that there's a flow, dia in the Greek. In fact, let me show you that. Right here in the word through. Dia means through. And if we were to talk about this in terms of preposition, it does not mean by. It doesn't mean that it is it doesn't mean that it is the result of, but instead that there is a pathway through, a pathway, a prescribed pathway, a tunnel, a conduit. Okay, dia. All right, and see there, right there, denoting the channel of an act. Right, that's the preposition dia. So through, right, him. And then we also have Acts chapter 17, where Paul addresses those at the Acropolis, right? I think it's 17. It might be. Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay. Yep. Starting verse 23 of Acts chapter 17. For I was walking along and saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God, whom you worship without knowing, is the one I'm telling you about. He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs. For he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. For from one man he created all the nations throughout the earth. He decided beforehand when they should arise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Okay, so we need to understand some very important concepts here. First of all, have you ever actually tried to anthropomorphize electricity? No, you have not. You have not looked up at these high tension, high voltage power lines that stretch for miles and miles and miles. And when you walk under them, they go, bzzz, right? And when you walk under them, there's this buzzing sound. And say, well, I'll tell you what, that's the hand of God, right? Or that particular piece of electricity is listening to me. We don't do that. We don't do that because we look at electricity as something that is not spiritual. But electricity itself is the result of an electromagnetic attraction as a result of a charge and a field and all this other stuff. But we don't ever anthropomorphize it and say, well, there's a hand there, or the eye of the Lord goes to and fro looking on the earth to see if there's anyone good. There's no eye in electricity. And yet we claim that electricity was created by none other than Nikola Tesla, not God. And so as a result of that, somewhere along the lines, we're going to have to accept that if we go back to our filter that if I'm going to worship a God, he better be the biggest and baddest of them all. And that he does not have an equal or opposite thing to him. So if he's the intensification of all energy in the universe, and I should have maybe called it energy instead of power, the intensification. What does that mean, intensification? The most densest version and highest vibration, which consequently is an infinite vibration when we start to get into vortex mathematics and toroidal patterns of everything that exists. And yet at the same time, we understand that that's happening right now at this moment, that the actual origin of all things is happening right now. Then we accept that emanation is an ongoing process present within us. And in that way, we are linked all the way back to whatever the start of everything was. And in that way, your actual life itself is connected to that very beginning moment over time. But it's happening right now. Because why? Because that's how fast it's occurring. It's just when we start to measure it over time, that's when we start to get into, okay, I was born in the 70s. That's a long time after the 40s, which is when my parents were born, okay, or 50s. And so as a result of that, then what we're working with is this idea that there's this constant upload, okay? Constant upload of energy from the very origin of creation happening right now in this moment, okay? All right, so that is the concept of emanation. So let's go to the board real quick and talk about emanation. That's not the board. Do that a lot. Okay, so the way that I want you to think about this then is that we have here at the top a system that has a one-way flow down to another system. This system in and of itself is self-existent. Okay? Self-existent. This exists as a result how do I want to word this? Existence, let's try this. Existence, oof. Existence dependent. That's the word I'm thinking of. Dependent. Okay? Existence dependent, which means what? It's created. Which means that there was a conscious intention behind its existence. Something decided that it was going to exist. That is emanation. The very thought that you would exist is the very power of that existence. Okay? Now, the reason that's important is because this is the greater, right? Remember that? This is the lesser, and this is the answer, and this is the question. What does that mean? That means that for every question, there's an answer, and for every answer, there's a question. There's a symbiotic relationship. What was appointed to answer the question was a greater. because there's an existence of a lesser. Now, when we start with the first principle of that concept, we remember that there's this idea of this force. See, how do I want to draw this? I want to draw this in this manner. There is a force going out in all directions, right? The intensification of all energy in the universe, in whatever energy that exists, because we know the conservation of energy says energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but instead just changes into something else. Then we have to agree that this always existed, but that it is a source of the existence of energy in our reality. Okay? Conservation of energy only applies to the physical universe in this dimension. Okay? All right. So now the premise is that now there is this idea that it wants to give to something else. And so it creates a vessel to receive, and that vessel is created with a boundary so that it can never actually attain to this. So let's see, what are we going to call this? We're going to call this source, okay? That's how we're going to do this. We're going to call this source, okay? And then along comes a thought that it wants to give to something else, but there's nothing else that exists besides it, okay? And so as a result of that, then there is a boundary set to prevent this from ever becoming this. And so we're going to say this is a little bit, let's say it's a little bit, little a little bit not God. How about that? Is it still God? Yes, of course, but it's a little bit not God. And that little bit not God can never be achieved to be source, because why? Source, and you know what? I'm going to actually change this label to a little bit not source. Okay? So it's a little bit not the source of all energy in the universe. Okay? So now we know that this is a limitation. And it is also a definition. Okay? And we know that if it's a definition, remember, there is a direct emanation connection between these two. But it starts out with a limitation and a definition. The definition is that it is a little bit not the source. The limitation is that it can never be the source. So let me go ahead and write that in there. Never be source. Okay, those are the limitations and the definitions. Now, beyond that, it is source. Why? Because number one, it is directly existing as a result of a thought by this consciousness. It's a direct result of this consciousness thinking about a lesser. Okay? That lesser needs to exist. Okay, but that consciousness sets one single important criteria. It wants the vessel, or sorry, the lesser. In fact, let me do what I'm doing here. We'll go ahead and color these a different color so that we can maintain titles within the context of this discussion. So in this case, this is going to be think about a lesser, right? Think about a lesser, and it wants the lesser to what? To choose elevation. Why? Because there's as long as, so if we accept that this is number one, okay, then this is 0.9 something. We can accept that this thing can elevate to infinity, point infinity. If it can elevate to point infinity, it really never, ever, ever is actually imperfect. It just can never be one. Got that? And so it's 0.9999999 all the way out to infinity. So it can never be source, right? But it has to choose elevation, which is a very long journey. Elevation is a long journey. Okay, so now what is absolutely important is to accept that even though this is not necessarily source, it is not a separate entity that has existence as being, say, another God, but instead is a version or a form of creation. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to look at after this choice occurs, what happens? So the thing that happens is after this choice occurs and acceptance of the benevolence of source occurs on this lesser, which consequently we need to label lesser, don't we? Once the acceptance has occurred, then that particular entity is elevated to a position not equal to, but definitely not diminished in its capacity to be source. Where this turns into something important is when we get to the third position, which is basically where we have the second contraction. And so I'm going to illustrate this a little bit different, but it's the same concept. And what we're going to do is just use different colors here. So I'm going to start with source being this outer circle like this, okay? And then from source into the lesser, and then from the lesser into a greater lesser, by which now, and this is intrinsically important, I'm going to do this in green, this particular entity, which I'm going to identify with this frequency thing, is basically an Elohim. So an Elohim in its greatest form is power. But the way that you need to think about it is in the sense of it being not only does it have this interaction going on, but it has this interaction going on. Which means what? A an Elohim is in two states, the state of being a lesser and being a greater. This particular thing here is a lesser, right? But this particular thing here is a greater, whoops, wrong pin. This particular thing here is a greater and a lesser. It's in two states. But here's the interesting part. It cannot be both at the same time. It cannot. So it either focuses on the Father or it focuses on the children. Okay? And so why is this so important? Because that means that there is a requirement for it to be both things. It has to be the lesser to the Father and the greater to the children. Okay? And if you haven't figured out by now, this thing that's got this green squiggly around it is a mother. Okay? So now what we need to do is we need to start to change our thinking a little bit and understand that an Elohim has two states. The state of being a greater and the state of being a lesser. Not true of the intensification of all power in the universe, but in order for anything to exist, there had to be a place set apart from that intensification of all energy in the universe, that where things could exist in a dialed back version so that it could choose to elevate. It can't elevate to the complete source, but it can elevate pretty high. Now, if you accept that children eventually mature and then become graders, therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, then we can accept that also this particular individual entity will what? Will also contract in order to have what? Children. But what's interesting is there will be a mother and there will be an offspring as well. And so we'll go ahead and we'll make one more circle here. Okay. And so you can see how this goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on until there's no longer an option for contraction. So when we accept that there is a father as in the sovereign of the camp, right? We accept that there is a father who is the source of all existence. Then we accept that creation itself is a mother in the sense that not only does it receive its authority, power, whatever, from the father, but also the mother has what? Offspring to give to, and thereby there's a necessity for elevation. Okay, and so the reason why that is important is because this is going to be a rough one. Yahweh is not the intensification of all power in the universe, but instead is that choice to create and receive, in the sense that Yahweh, Elohim, is the highest Elohim. We need to accept that an Elohim only exists. Listen, this is important. An Elohim only exists if that system was dialed back. So the fact that it says Yahweh Elohim formed man or Adam out of the dust of the ground, and if you guys knew what dust meant, it would be a whole nother level. One of these days we'll get into it, but I have a feeling those will be in closer to the end of all things. But the premise is that basically what we have is we have an idea here that Yahweh Elohim is the highest Elohim. And therefore, we cannot label this orange circle Yahweh, but instead, Ein Sof Or. Which is what? What's Ein Sof Or? Without end light. The source of all light. Light without end, a replenishing light, because we know at the quantum level, the core existence of all matter is light. Okay? All right. So the focus or understanding is that Yahweh is here. And I'm writing big because I'm not sharing the screen. And I know you don't necessarily like to look at the back of my head. And I know that there's rabbis rolling over in the grave because I just wrote Yahweh on the board. And I'm going to erase that later. But the premise is that this right here is Yahweh. Now, how did we get from oops, that was my glass of water. How did we get from the concept of Yod He Vav He and whatever pronunciation you want to assign to it to the word Lord? And this is important because when we're talking about this, what we need to understand is that there is this context of the word Lord being the function of our reality as Christians. Right? So how did we get there? Well, there's a couple of very, very important things. The first thing that we need to do is talk about the concept in English of the word Lord. So I'm going to open the etymological dictionary here, and here's what we have. Mid-13th century, laverd or loverd, from the Old English halford, which is master of a household, ruler. Feudal lord, superior, husband, also God, translating the Latin dominus. Greek, kurios in the New Testament. Hebrew, Yahweh in the Old, though the Old English Triton was more frequent. Old English Halford is a contraction of an earlier alphabet, literally one who guards the loaves, from half, bread or loaf, and I know I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, and then viad, which is keeper, right? From the Proto-English root vir, to perceive or watch out for. Okay. And so the way that I want you to think about this is that this was contextually used first as a word to describe somebody with authority. And if we're looking looking from the PIE or the Proto-Indo-European, we do find something very interesting, and that is that the cultural element here is, if you can beat me in battle, then you have to protect me, right? If I'm going to submit to your authority because you can beat me in battle, then you have to protect me. And so that via becomes the important or operative word here. But it's now pronounced Lord, right? So that is where we get the etymology of the word Lord. Should that be assigned to Yahweh? Well, no. I will help you understand this a little better by looking at the Nekodim of the word Yahweh. So the way that I'm going to do this, I'm going to go ahead and go back to Genesis chapter 2, where we get to what? Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. There's our Yahweh Elohim in the Hebrew right there. Yahweh Elohim. But what I want you to see is this part right here, which is, let me do this way. Let's do it this way. Okay. And very specifically, we are going to circle this right here and this right here. Why? Because this is Yeh-Va. Yeh-Va. So why did this occur? Why did they put these Nekodim in here? Why did they put these vowel points? Why are those two dots there and that there if they're not actually pronounced as Yahweh? When really, technically, what we should have here is okay, well, let's not use the crayon. Let's see, let's use the 5-point pin and see how that works. So right here should be this, and right here should be this. That would be a proper pronunciation of Yahweh. Well, there's a number of reasons why this is true, but the biggest reason is because superimposed over the name Yahweh, the Nekodim are the Nekodim from the name Adonai. Okay, let me prove that to you. Okay. So first, what we need to do is go to the first usage of the word Adonai, and I believe the best place for that is going to be, I think the first usage of Adonai is actually going to be Adonai Bezek, but let's just do this. Let's see, Adonai. Let's do this. Adonai. Okay, I'm sorry, it's governed to the New Testament. That's why it's doing that. Okay. So we need to go to all of the Bible. There we go. And Adonai is still not coming up. Interesting. Okay, let's try this way. Maybe it's B. There we go. Yep, it's Adonai Zedek. I was close. Adonai Zedek. So we go over here to that verse. Oh. There we go. And we'll go to Adonai, and that is going to be right there. And so Adonai, the letters from Adonai, and specifically the well, actually, this actually wouldn't work because it's in a certain form. Let's see if I can find another example here. And that's actually not gonna work out the way that I planned. Let's see if Adom will help us out here. And I'm looking for a very specific, there it is, right there. That's the one. That's Adonai I'm looking for. Notice the Nekodim here. I will make it big just like it did before. Notice the Nekodim have the two dots and the little, the little plus sign thing underneath the letters. These were superimposed over it. Cantors are supposed to look at the Nekodim and see how to pronounce high or low tones, and then they are supposed to sing the verse, and when they sing the verse and they see those high and low tones, if they encounter the name Yod He Vav He, they needed to be reminded to say Adonai, right? Now, what's interesting is it's changed even more now to calling it Hashem, right? But Adonai is still a pretty legitimate thing. For example, if you go into a synagogue today, you'll hear the Shema, and they'll say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. But really, it is Shema Israel Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad. So, where we get the idea of saying that it is the Lord is in that. Now, the reason why that's important is because I want you to reassign your thinking to Yahweh being in a state of being a greater and a lesser. There's actually two Yahwehs in the Kabbalistic thinking. Now, is that two gods? No. No. You don't understand. This whole entire thing is still Yahweh. And in him we live and move and have our being is going to become very important in a moment. But what I wanted you to see is this idea of a fluctuation between a greater and lesser. So the context or the concept of a perceivable God versus an imperceivable God becomes very, very, very important. So now let's move over to a very different kind of pendulum, okay? All right, so at the top, let's go ahead and let's assign some color here. Let's just use this color right here. At the top of this thing, we've got this point. And that point is basically the balancing act between these two emanations. On the one side, we would have the emanation of Yahweh as the lesser and Yahweh as the greater. And the way that I want you to think about this is in the sense of what? We will call this, and now it will make sense, because I know some of you are like, oh my God, this dude is like making all kinds of gods. No, I am not. We are dealing with Echad here. It's just we're dealing with the various attributes of our of Echadness. This is unto the least of these. Okay? Unto the least of these. And then on this side is let there be, and there was. So you notice we're not talking about an entity here, we're talking about a concept, right? So here's the swing, here's the balance of the pendulum swinging back and forth, creating what? Vibration. Through what process? Oscillation. I'm going to butcher this bad boy. Oscillation, okay? Which is what? Hertz. Now, why is that so important? Because now you could understand how we can see an emanation of a question and an emanation of an answer being the exact same being. Yeshua says, you will always have the poor with you, and if you give unto the least of these, then you are giving to me. And if you are giving to me, then you are actually all greater. So the context here, oh boy, I feel like I'm going to get shot, right? Is that you are greater than Yeshua when you give to the least of these. You are an authority over Yeshua because you are in a greater position than Yeshua, because he said, if you give unto the least of these, you give to me. Then we know that he is the question that causes the answer to become entangled. But the answer is the source of all things. But in order for Yahweh to be an Elohim, he had to be both. So now it makes sense. He's the need and he's the answer, and we are the conduit. Oh, but it gets better. Okay? All right. So now we see unto the least of these, and also let there be and there was, are what? Two different states of the same element. Now watch this, because this is some of the arguments that Trinitarians make, right? But now watch this. Here's the part where we depart from Christianity, and like I said, I feel like I'm going to get shot. Okay, here we go. This is indeed not actually something that is limited to that first contraction. Remember the circles? Let's go back to that for a minute. Remember, there's these concentricities, right, that are the result of a willingness to give and receive, and really eventually to receive in order to give. And Yahweh is the Lord of them all as the first receiver and giver. But really, technically, what it is he's the first perceivable limitation of God. In other words, the only way, look, how do I explain this? The only way that you can acknowledge Yahweh as God is if we define him. The moment we define him, he ceases to be the undefinable God. Right? Ein Sof Or. Ein Sof Or is undefinable. Infinite light. And before that is Ein Sof, which is what? Infinite nothingness. In other words, there is nothing else besides it. But if we say there's nothing else besides him, which is what Paul did, in him we live and move and have our being, we assign a gender element, which is the greater element, the giver, the bestower. But that doesn't change the fact that he's also a receiver from Ein Sof Or. So, listen, I get that you want to beat me up right now because I'm claiming that your God needs to receive something from something, but you're not understanding that it's more along the lines of the change from being just infinite light to being a conscious process that exists above and outside of all things. But what you need to understand is that this bad boy right here, that little purple circle, that bad boy right there, is an Elohim. And we could do this way. We could say, okay, so the outer circle is 100% light. Okay, 100%. Nothing can exist in that realm because there is only one thing. And if that one thing has any type of energy that exists with it, it is it, because it's vibrating at a level that we don't understand. But then we can go ahead and label this in this sense, that we can go down to this concept here. 99%, right? But then we can label the next one as what? As 98%. We're still dealing with an extraordinary amount of perfection, an extraordinary amount of flawlessness, an extraordinary amount of limitlessness, an extraordinary amount of lack of definition. Okay? But then we get down to this next level, and we're working with what? 90. Right? We're working with 97%. And then we get down to the next level and we're working with 96%. So as if I kept going, eventually I would arrive at 0.0000000001% light. And at that moment, we can accept that that's the lowest and that there can't be any more contractions. And so all of a sudden we need to start elevating. Now, what that means in this sense is that just as the 100 or just as the 99% light has this pendulum of question and answer unto the least of these versus let there be and it was. Also, there needs to be an understanding that if that's true, the lowest possible question is 1% light, and the highest possible answer is 100. Well, actually, technically, we couldn't do that. Is going to be 99.99% light. Why is that so important? Because then we can accept that the lowest possible question, the question that's going to vibrate at the lowest amount of vibration, the lowest oscillation, actually needs to be elevated. That's the least of these. Okay? That's the least of these. So why is that so important? Because then what we get into is an idea that at the highest level of an answer is Yahweh. The only perceivable entity that we can call God and worship, because the other side we don't understand. Once we cross that threshold into that 100% light, sorry, all bets are off. Now, what this tells us is that if we were going to be in the image of God, then we have a question and we have an answer state, which means that because of that concentric reduction of light, we have within us this principle, which is what? You. Or better yet, I am. Now, the reason why that's important, this looks like an end. Okay. The reason why that's important is because now what we need to do is accept that we can be in two states, as the greater or as the lesser. But we can't exist in both at the same time. And so the premise is that right now, Yahweh is operating as the lowest question for us to be able to give to him. That's Yeshua saying, unto the least of these you've given to me, right? And then on the other side, we have this concept of Yahweh being what? The answer to the question, the great provider, Yahweh Yireh, right? That is Abraham saying, the Lord my provider. What is important is to understand that as that pendulum swings, very much not what's going on with Yahweh, but what's going on with us is we are the answer, right, to the question. But we are also the question, and we are in that state not simultaneously. Let me explain. Remember the cycle between lower vibration and higher vibration. Okay? So, what verse we need to look at here is actually going to be in, I believe it is 2 Corinthians. Let me navigate there real quick. It's going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, something very interesting is stated by whoever it is that God prays to. Right? Whoever it is that whoever it is Paul prays to, sorry, not God. That's a Freudian slip there, right? Okay. Even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 times I begged who? The Lord. Let me show you. Kurian, which is it's the accusative case of kurias, which is accusative and nominative and genitive. I don't even want to get into all that mess. All right. So 3 times I begged the Lord, Adonai, to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weaknesses. My power works best in weaknesses. That is the word dunamis, power. And just to give you an idea of this power, without a whole lot of elaboration, because we've done a lot of study on this bad boy privately and not as a group, but I've done a lot of study on this bad boy. I want to go to a specific verse in Mark chapter 5, I believe it is. Yep, there it is. Mark chapter 5, verse 30. Jesus realized that the healing power had gone out from him. So he turned around the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? What story is that? That's the story of the woman with the issue of blood, right? Let's see, is that 20? There it is. Verse 31, right? Which is what? This woman who had the issue of blood. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. But he says, I felt the power go out of me, right? I felt the power go out of me, realizing that the healing power had gone out of him. Now, the woman is the question. Yeshua is the answer. So he's the greater, even though that he said unto the least of these, you're doing it to me. In this case, he is in the answer state. And what's going on? Dunamis is going on, right? Dunamis, right here. Boom. dunamis. Now, what's important for you to know is that those two are connected to each other. My dunamis is what? Perfected in weaknesses. Now, forget the part about Paul's thorn in the side and Satan buffeting him and all that stuff. Think about Yahweh's response. My answer, dunamis, is perfected in weakness. Okay? And so here's the interesting part of this. If you are a greater, then your dunamis is perfected in someone else's weakness. But if you are a lesser, then your answer is somewhere else, and you are the question. And that's exactly what's happening at the intensification of all energy in the universe. It is flowing out and hitting that first limitation that says no, and then no with condition, and then I will create something in my image, right? And so the premise is that now what we have flowing down 750,000 volts of electricity flowing down through transformers or thresholds of vibration into a more fluid form, from an ethereal form to a more fluid form, and in some cases flowing all the way down to something extremely solid in this last place of concentricity, this Malkut or kingdom that needs to be elevated. And there needs to be tikkun olam because there are low vibrations here. And the ascendancy of elevation occurs only through reciprocation. And therefore, you receive in order to give to a lesser. But sometimes you are that lesser. Let me explain how this works now in terms of our picture again, really quick. So jumping back to the board, we are going to look at this idea of a glass, okay? And inside of that glass, we have water, right? But it's not full. Now, when we're looking at this, we think to ourselves, this is, let me put this in red because this is our thinking. Oh, goodness. These pens sometimes. All right, here we go. Empty, right? That is our thinking, and it's inside of us, right? We think that's empty, and we think this is full. But the way that Yahweh thinks about this is, the way Yahweh thinks about this is that it is potential and that this is ministry. So what he is looking at is that your weakness that has already been filled is your strength. I don't know, I just spelled it funky. Is your strength, right? And what has not yet been filled is your hope. Okay? But your strength becomes your expertise. Spelled that wrong too. Expertise. And your expertise becomes your ministry. Okay? Ministry. And so if your strength becomes your expertise and your expertise becomes your ministry, then anything that has been overcome is not fullness or fulfillment. Oh, no, on the contrary, it's your purpose, right? Ministry, let's get rid of that word because that's a little bit too Christian, right? Because we're working with something a lot higher than Christian philosophy here, but instead becomes your purpose. Okay? So now the way that I want you to think about this is that whenever you are not in a state of being completely filled up, or what we call melo, or what we call in the Greek plerou, right? When you're to your fullest extent, you are what? So let's draw some examples here real quick, just in that thought process. So we have one glass here that is really empty, okay? And we say this is a and I actually wasn't supposed to do all this in red because it was our thinking. So let me change that. But anyways, so the premise is that basically the way that we want to think about this is in terms of this is a lesser, or the question. In that state, do you have any business pouring out into another? Nope, you do not. Now, don't get me wrong, because that state can change very quickly. The pendulum can swing the other direction very quickly. And so as a result of that, then what we have is then a little bit different of a state where we have kind of a half full situation. Do we have, is that any different? Has that changed any? Nope. Even one who has come that far, which means what? We're starting to get into something that has to do with where you are at. Because one of the mistakes that I have made in this teaching, well, okay, I didn't really make the mistake, but where I actually may have caused some error in thinking is that there is a limit to fullness. And there is area where you are not actually usable. See, what people don't realize is that this very little bit can still be poured out. That's the widow's mites, right? Do we have business there? Not necessarily, but here's the crazy part about it. It's where you start. In the sowing season, it's where you start. You start where you're at. You don't think in your mind, oh, you know what? I don't have enough money to give to the poor. Yes, you do. I'm sure you have a piggy bank somewhere where you could go put 10 cents into the guy with the bell, put it in his bucket, because that's giving to the poor. You don't understand. It has to start somewhere. Pouring out, sowing has to start somewhere. So do you have business there? No, not necessarily. But here's the crazy part about it. If there is a greater present, I got news for you guys. It is not for you to pour into, but for them to pour into you. Okay? Which means you have swung onto the least of these side, which means you have to know your season. Now, there's a reason why that's important. The dynamic is cyclical. The dynamic is cyclical, and if it is cyclical, then the way that you need to understand this is you are made weak in order to receive, but you receive in order to give, which makes you weak again. It's the cost. It's the cost. So as you are reducing in energy, It is time for that dunamis to be made perfect within you. But did that make Paul in some way statist where he should no longer be in ministry? No. And so when the pendulum swings one way, he can't be the greater. He has to be the lesser and receive. That's the rule. You have to go ahead and make the choice to elevate by receiving, but you don't receive for yourself. You receive in order to give. Now, let's talk about circadian rhythms real quick. Circadian rhythm is basically the difference between night and day and is based upon the exposure of your pituitary gland to light. That light then stops producing melatonin. When there is a reduction in light, there is an increase in melatonin. What's melatonin do? Makes you sleepy, right? And so the premise is as the light comes in, there's less melatonin. Obviously, in those moments, you're operating in your strength. But anybody who has worked a double shift and that other shift was the late night shift can tell you that there's a point of exhaustion in the body in which there has to be rest. That rest is based upon a function of the circadian rhythm. In other words, actually the other way around. Rest is a function of the circadian rhythm. Why? Because when there is darkness, melatonin is released, and melatonin causes you to go to sleep. During sleep, you rest, right? As you're resting, your body is going into a state in which it's not using all of its faculties, and your breathing is reduced, your heart rate is reduced. In fact, if you go into delta REM sleep, you are the closest to death that you can possibly be without dying. Why is that so important? Because it proves that rest is actually a state of a lesser and not a greater. Rest is where dunamis is made perfect. What's perfection? Filling. Okay? That word perfection is lost in English understanding as being something flawless. But instead, the way you need to think about it is my power, my dunamis, fills you when you are weak, so that you will be strong for the rest of the sheep, for the rest of the lessers. And I promise you, just as I said earlier, does this particular vessel have any business in ministry? No, but I'll bet you he could still give an encouraging word. I'll bet you he could drop a widow's mite in the bucket, right? Who's poised to be an Elohim, to manifest the higher intuition, the higher Yahweh within them? Obviously the greater, obviously the one who's already been made perfect as a result of their weaknesses, which gets you into the idea that there are certain dynamic levels of this, right? This particular lesser is still lesser than this. I'm sorry. Here, let me get rid of this. This is confusing me. This lesser is full. There's no more room. So it is actually in a different state than this one. But this one's definitely already got some strength, expertise, and purpose. Spelled expertise wrong. It's driving me crazy. Okay, so the premise is that when we're dealing with this, we need to understand the dynamic here is that all of this is the weakness that still needs to be made perfect. All of this is the expertise that needs to be poured out. A full one is an indication that they've already been made perfect. That's why Yeshua said to the man, if you would be perfect, then sell all your belongings, go give it to the poor, and follow me. Because what was going to happen? He was going to elevate. All of that was about to reciprocate back on him. If he would have sold everything he had and gave it all to the poor, do you have any idea how rich he would be? Any idea? Right? And so from that perspective, then we understand that the pendulum swings in seasons, right? And those seasons have to do with whether you are going to be in a state of the feminine principle of God, which is the receiver, or the masculine principle of God, which is the giver. And so the whole focus here or idea is that the Sabbath is designed for you to receive, and specifically the Sabbath as a physical action of ceasing of everything is actually his dunamis being made perfect in you so that you can go out and you can what? You can halakha, you can go walk amongst the people as a king, a melech, or an agent of the king, a malach. Remember, that's what you cease from on the Shabbat. Malach, you stop on the Sabbath. You cease from that. You shall do no work or servile work. That word work is malakah, right? Which is the act of negotiating as an agent or as a sovereign. So the principle here is that the whole week you shall do work, you shall rule, you shall pour out, you shall walk amongst the people, but on the Shabbat you are the lesser. Now you understand why Sabbath was made for man, but now you understand the spiritual dynamic of it. Now, the reason why this is so important is because as you swing from one side to the other, you need to understand your position in terms of what you need. Because let me tell you what humanity is doing right now. They are either receiving to this point and never giving, and therefore are elevated to a position and they become stagnant. They are receiving or they're refusing to receive because of mistrust, because of pride, right? Well, I don't need that, right? Or some other thing like they don't deserve it, right? Desert. But the idea is that they are not in the correct state. Now, I've shown you before that a masculine and masculine principle together will not comply. A feminine and feminine principle together will not comply. Only a masculine and feminine principle together will create that moment of creation. They will make a space for a new creation. Now, where we get into a difficulty is I have to draw these squares. But what people don't understand is that those limitations don't actually exist in the sense of capacity. It exists in the sense of vibration. Shabbat should bring you into the sundown of Sabbath on Saturday, should bring you to a state as you go into the evening as feeling as though you are vibrating at a higher frequency. Your pouring out during the week will lower your frequency because that's what it's doing. You are sharing energy with another and therefore accepting a deficit of energy. That's the cost. That's the cost that went all the way to the cross. right? It wasn't a cross. But the point being is that's the cost that eventually led to he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, and gave you status from the foundations of the earth to the whatever's going to happen beyond our understanding in the future. We can accept that there was a retroactive gift of status as the righteousness of God. What's righteousness? Equal distribution of wealth. Back to pouring out, right? That's what a righteous person does. We call the box that's in the back of the synagogue where you put your money tzedakah, which is the Hebrew derivative of tzedek, which means righteousness. And in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, to equally distribute. And so, whereas we have this idea of us being in a state and needing to wait before we pour into another, we just need to make sure that that person who's present is not supposed to pour into us. And we need to recognize our season when we need that. Because contained within the days themselves are Shabbats, times of rest. We sleep every day and we cease. Here's the irony. You will go lay in your bed and put your head on your pillow and go night-night, but you won't rest on Shabbat. And it's the same need and it's the same process, only it's a higher vibrational process. It's fluid, or better yet, ethereal. I'm so sick of the word spiritual, I don't even want to use it. But the function is that it is something higher than just your body physically resting. And don't get me wrong, there's a bunch of mess that we could get into about what actually happens while you're asleep, or why the Jews put into their prayer at the beginning of the day, thank you for restoring my soul to my body. We can get into all kinds there, couldn't we? But instead, what we need to focus on is the idea that if Sabbath was made for man and man for this, and the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and we understand that there's an authoritative element, but that there's also a function that it is here to serve you, but you don't understand that every single Moedim, in fact, I'm going to throw something out there that'll really blow your mind. All of the things contained in the fourth day were created for you and are conspiring on your behalf to be obedient to your dominion as a son of Adam, so that you can be elevated to be a son of God. Let me prove that to you. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. We'll start there. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will be reigned over the fish of the sea, reign over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and small animals that scurry along the ground. Yeah. Let's just go ahead and go to verse 28, because that dominion doesn't necessarily equate. Then God blessed him and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Okay, that's Adam and the sons of Adam and the Son of Man, right? The Son of Man. That's why, see, and here's another thing. We say, oh yeah, Son of Man is some sort of messianic title. No, it's not. Look at Ezekiel, Son of Man, can these dry bones live? Come on, that was not Yeshua standing there with God asking him that. All right, and so the premise is a Son of Man, Son of Adam is somebody who has the dominion over the earth. Now, does that mean that the dominion is going to be is going to be big or is going to be intense? No, not necessarily, but we do know that the universe conspires on behalf of the sons of men to be absolutely obedient to them. But now I'm going to add another part to this. Why does it do that? Well, we need to go into the New Testament. We need to go into the latter writings. We're going into Romans chapter 8, and very specifically, we're going to go into Romans chapter 8, verse. I have to find this one because I always forget where it's at. And I'm actually going to show you this in the NASB after I find it because I can't stand the NLT version. It drives me crazy. For this specific verse. We see, priest is predestined. Let's see, for we were saved in this hope. Okay, here we go. Here we go. That the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. If we go over to the New King James, I believe we're going to get what we're looking for here, I think. Let's see, here it is right here, starting in verse 19. So let's hear this all together. For the earnest expectation of creation, what's that? Hope of creation, eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. Why would there be a necessity for a revealing of the sons of God? Why would there be a necessity for the revealing of the sons of God? Why does the creation earnestly wait for it, right? And that's verse 19. Verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Don't get caught up in that word suffering. I know that gets scary. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God literally means that creation is waiting for something new to happen in the children of men, in that they elevate. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Okay, now, because the creation itself also will be delivered from bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the sons of God, children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pains together until now. Right? Not only that, but we also have the first fruits of the Spirit. Even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. I'm not going to get into the redemption of our body today. I think one of the craziest arguments that I ever had with a Torah observant individual was the Christian concept of the redemption of the body. We'll go ahead and leave that alone for now. What I really want you to get your mind wrapped around is that all of at the entire universe, which is a created thing, is conspiring on your behalf to be absolutely obedient to the sons of Adam so that they may elevate as sons of God, so that the universe itself will be released from its service to the sons of Adam. Now, what will really blow your mind is when you get the idea that if this concentrism that occurred, this idea of these contractions occurred in this lowest realm is 99% darkness, and that this source is happening now, then there will always have the poor among us. We will always have the poor among us. The 99% darkness will always, always be here. And there will always be on us to elevate the lessers into a position of understanding, and that reciprocation will raise an us back into that other realm. But that other realm is yet again another dissension back into elevation. There's your water cycle. Was Solomon talking about water? Nope. He was talking about the dunamis, the power or the intensity of the intensification of all energy in the universe in a state of dissension to create your very existence and then elevate you back into that first principle. And it's happening over and over and again. And if you want proof of that, look up what happens in your spine with the fluids, how they ascend and descend, and what's involved with that in terms of circadian rhythms and in terms of 30-day or 29-day cycles, because you will find some very, very interesting information about how your physiology is more proof of this ascension and descension, or this dual state of being the question and the answer, and us being the conduit. There is really no other recap that I need to put here. When you start to realize that day 4 was made for man and not man for day 4, your mind is going to expand. Your understanding is going to expand. I didn't spend years and years and years in a yeshiva school gaining understanding of rabbinical literature. I spent years and years and years trying to understand how to give. And the truth is that's what put me on this path, this dynamic. Go drop a dime into a bucket with intention, because that's where I started. I had a $1 bill that I found on the ground, and I thought, I'm going to try this. I walked over and I dropped a dime in, and I kid you not, later on that week, somebody gave me $100. But that money is just an example of correspondence. That money is just an example of transaction. I'm talking about something greater, where all of a sudden you are healing broken bones, and you are making things that are causing problems or disease in your body to become non-existent. I am talking about an elevation of all of humanity as a result of a recognition of when you need to receive and when you need to give, and the intention behind receiving needing to be to give. When you can get that, that's when the abundance of the spiritual universe and all that it entails becomes the abundance of your reality. And it's important for you to understand that requires you to do something first now, right? An initiation and a ritual to move you in the direction to demonstrate that that's where you want to be and that's what you want to do. And in that process, the rest will begin to fall into place, because if your intention is to pour out and give, your resources will be limitless. It is when we fall into the deficits of that reality and the failures of those deficits, or the fear of the failures of those deficits, that we don't have the abundant resources. And I'm not only talking about money. Money is inconsequential. It is just a part of the process. Okay? So I'm going to say Shabbat Shalom now. For those of you who are on YouTube, I hope that you put some questions in the comments. I'm going to check the comments this week and see if I can answer some of your questions, because I know you guys are probably going crazy right now. And like I said, it probably gets shot. But Shabbat Shalom.